So I'm very, very happy to be able to introduce to you now my colleague, Ed Eigen. Ed Eigen is Associate Professor in the History of Architecture and Landscape Architecture here at the GSD, and his work focuses on intersections of the human and natural sciences. He's currently also preparing a book called An Anomalous Plan, a study of laboratory spaces in 19th century France. So please join me in welcoming Ed and our first speaker. Ed, are you here? Okay, so while we're, I saw him this morning, so I'm sure he'll actually be joining me in some minutes. So while we're waiting, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Natalie, who is sitting right here. Arriving. Okay, fantastic. Thanks, Ed.
I don't need any pointers. Yeah. Good morning, all. It's nice for once to be late without knowing one's late, so one doesn't even have to fret over it. Good morning. When looking at this extraordinary passenger manifest, that is the roster of presenters that Sonia and Charles have assembled from throughout Europe and America, it is impressive to remember that the specialists gathered by Carl Sauer, Bates, and Louis Munford for the conference Man's Role in Changing the Face of the Earth, convened at the Princeton Inn, Princeton, New Jersey, spring 1955, were among the earliest beneficiaries of one of the most fundamental socio-technological innovations in modern aviation, which was the magnetronic reservisor system, now known as SABRE, which underlies all of these orbits type things you guys use to make your connections relatively seamlessly. The conference in itself is memorable for its global view, something we now embrace, most notably articulated in E.A. Gutkin's vividly illustrated talk, Our World from the Air, Conflict and Adaptation, which is, in a modified sense of the word, a foundational text for our current and ongoing fascination with the view from above, the aerial view. The magnetronic reservisor, which required a small battalion of operators to handle, recorded reservations and tracked past patterns of usage, and was, again, an early predecessor to many of the reservation systems we now use online to facilitate our daily life. But with regard to Peter Gallison's comments last night, the expanded security zone of modern travel perhaps harkens back to an earlier conjectural technology, which was Vannevar Bush's MEMEX machine. Vannevar Bush we know is for his contributions to automatic fire control systems, which is to say the mating of aviation with cybernetics. Bush's MEMEX, or memory extender machine, a proto-hypertext microfiche-supported cloud of personal reference, is precisely the kind of thing that might be consulted when your passenger profile is prepared before you board a plane now. But the underlying technology remains the same. The reservisor was based on Howard Aiken, here of Harvard University, his Mark I computer, which used a drum memory for storage, essentially the same, one might say, as an Assyrian cylinder seal, something that presented one's bona fides, allowed one to continue on in travel upon one's good word. And by making these comments, I just wanted to suggest and insist on the importance of memory itself in all its media as we consider the various expertise and forms of operation that will be discussed this weekend as I introduce our speakers today who are engaged in diverse and very compelling ways in the history, sociology, and politics of aviation in the modern period. So our first speaker this morning is Nathalie Rossu. She is an architect and engineer who graduated from the École Polytechnique. She holds a PhD in urbanism from the University of Paris East. After having been in charge of urban studies for the Paris region, she joined the architecture office led by Paul Andreu and worked for the Paris Airports Corporation. Her research focused on the contemporary dynamics of the, focus on the contemporary dynamics of the metropolis, the imaginary of the city, and the relations between infrastructure and architecture. Her recent publications include Airports as Urban Narratives, and this morning she'll be speaking to us about the airport as urban artifact, the ecology of the frontier. So please.
Good morning. Thank you for the invitation. Over the past 20 years, airports have become one of the key recurrent topics in essays on the contemporary city. Non-places, generic cities, spaces of flows. Through this literature, the airport often plays a tricky exemplary role where it embodies apparent urban exteriority, acting as an illustrative reference or a bugbear. Certainly, its development raises vital questions concerning the content, purpose, and limits of urban planning based around flows and closely bound up with globalization. Airports are vectors for a whole range of expectations, providing a staple diet for anticipation films, and it undoubtedly has appeared alone to embody the globalization narrative and all its attendant excesses of fears, as well as the way in which this process has interacted with the city. However, while being exacerbated, the airport situation is not isolated regarding to the urban prism. Certainly, airports mark a frontier from the dense inhabited city, but they also wholly belong to the metropolitan sphere, and within this frame, the topic of the frontier permanently grows richer. Far from being isolated pieces, airports incorporate themselves within the metropolitan space through various impacts, from the downtown air terminal to the out-of-town platform, from the hub to its perimeter fence, from business centers out to travel zones. In this sense, together with other mega artifacts such as park systems, campus, or clusters, the airport web challenges the metropolitan contours and boundaries as well as its urban image. Due to their exile out of a consolidated city, airports actually produced both an interiority, which absorbs the city desires, and an exteriority, which is progressively absorbed within the metropolis. We can witness this trend in the manner in which airport authorities attempted to rebuild the link to their host city, whose distance represented a serious handicap, as shown through the Hong Kong case study, where the airport authority planned the airport move along with huge infrastructural projects, among which a metro line directly linking the outer airport to the hypercenter. As part of this headlong drive to tie the airports back into the urban environment, airport authorities also attempted to civilize the airport by incorporating urban signs and codes, while cities built downtown air terminals, replete with as complete a range of travel amenities as one would find in any self-respecting airport. In other words, airplane-less airports, which reimported functions that had previously been banished from the downtown area, offering all the attributes of an airport apart from planes. This is the meaning of the slogan, "The new airport in Central," echoing the former situation of the former airport, Kai Tak, close to the hypercenter. So urbanization of the airport and airportization of the urban, both situations are reflecting the extent to which the two spaces are inextricably linked in a relationship of ambiguity and hybridization. So airport permanently changes both its frontiers and the ones of the city it is part of, whether these frontiers are architectural, urban, dimensional, technological, even institutional, with the inextricable airport governance raised by the confrontation of powerful airport authorities and numerous local and metropolitan strata. And as soon as they are achieved, These changing frontiers call for their own transcendence, but more than others, airports confront to a future. This issue of a future to achieve being one of the vectors for the vitality of the airport imaginary. However, the reality of the imaginary gives a nearly impossible ambition, not to disappoint the dreamer. The intensity of airport imaginary may be coupled to the intensity of critics airport endorse. In other words, the confusion of representations we are facing in airport space may also be down to the fact that our representations are bound up just as much with the prolific imaginary potential of airports as with their apparent materiality, as shown through these various images of TWA terminal futures at the turn of the 21st century. Cinema has seized this confusion of feelings. An airport is quite a regular scenic place, often figuring a main character for films, as we can see through the exhibition. Airport is even more than a character. It has been a field for exploratory anticipations. Surrealist with La Jetée, which keeps on fascinating us. Chris Marker's films dedicated the Orly terraces as a place for projection of what James Graham Ballard named the interior landscapes of a time. Or ironical with Jacques Tati, who also chose Orly as a place for opening and final scenes of his film Playtime, produced in 1967. Again, airport is here a key character for his narrative, and the script continuously turns around aerial echoes, the travel agency, the voice of loudspeakers, the hostess of a strand bar. For Tati, airport embodies very well the imaginary world he wants to figure in his film. First scene echoes the airport with sounds, with the sky and the silhouette of Orly terminal parallelepiped glass and steel block. However, Tati clouds the issue while figuring other references, not linked to airport world, such as hospital atmosphere, for example. Airport is for Tati the place to emphasize the ambiguous status of new hypermodern spaces. And the film ends with the image of the elegant street lamps bordering the frontal road arriving to Orly Airport. In fine, spectators caught by the critical irony of the filmmaker wonder if they didn't stay in an airport during the whole film. Playtime catches the ambiguity of a fascinating place, which in the meantime reveals some paradox of hypermodernity. And in this sense, the film enlightens the shifting period that Paris airports confront at the same moment. As despite the enthusiastic Sunday trips out to Orly, the airport idyll would not last. 60s period was a shifting period of reversals as the festive, optimistic era of fascinating, mythical viewing terraces at Orly quickly blurred and was progressively consigned to the past. The advent of mass travel signaled the beginning of a chronic crisis that would have a lasting impact on aerial mobility. The aerial threat and challenge, exacerbated by all of the converging evils, undermined the perfect model of the airport as showcase and heralded uncertainty over the future as one of the dominant parameters of airport perception. This unstable nature of the airport environment, subject to relentless mutations and technological and urban transformations, already had been observed as early as 1962 by Reyner Badham, who highlighted this conflicting representation in his essay, The Obsolescent Airport, as well as the shrinking temporalities characterized by these never-ending development airports. In 1965, Aéroports de Paris hired a team of psychosociologists for a study which would last 3 years. The study aimed to know better about the expectations of airport passengers and workers. It also inaugurates the beginnings of the reflection about the new airport to be designed and built in Roissy, and the shift from an airport place conceived of a showcase for a future suburban city to a prototype for a future flows infrastructure. Techniques used by the authors of the study were close to the psychoanalytic exam, asking airports workers and travelers about the feelings on airport and flight experience through awake dreams, which enabled to abolish resistance. Conclusions raised the confused feelings of passengers, quite irrational and dual. between a persistent, however anachronous, representation of the status of privileged elite and the new image of the aerial travel, quite commonplace through its progressive democratization. This is no more an adventure or luxury. This is a commonplace means of transport, the function of which is purely utilitarian. Here emerged the feeling of being caught between the dream of a personalized and privileged transportation and the close reality of a mass transportation, uncomfortable and quite banal. Dual representations are also linked to a combination of fear and excitement, euphoria and nostalgia, which comes before the moment of flight. The elevation as dreamed produces all kinds of contradictory feelings, power and wonder, failure and destruction. The study was also outlining ideal views of the airport as a space for paradoxical expectations. Quotation, all that is contained in this word terminal, to open the word and look at behind as a door opened onto a new world. Airports are like waiting halls, an empty hall. When arriving, we are emptying our mind of what it had previously. According to the authors, all details of the airport organization could be interpreted like so many obstacles which would generate many frustrations and demands. This study has been read and discussed by the new teams of Aéroports de Paris in charge of the preliminary design of Roissy. Among them, Paul Andreu, the chief architect for Roissy, was quite aware on both issues of obsolescence and uncertainty, and expectations about the real truth of a place. Roissy would also signal the progressive disappearance of the airport visitor figure, initiating another structural shift for airport design. In the United States, visits were not anymore part of the main airport activities, and in 1967, all the operators were now talking about visitors' traps. Thus, terminal was no more a spectacular place to visit for flight contemplation, but rather a dynamic space, providing above all the experience of moving through space. Airport design would not condensate references, but experiences through an architecture of a movement that Eero Saarinen had inaugurated in TWA Terminal, a building which inspired Roissien design. Staying in the airport was now put as a travel before the travel, and Paul Andreu echoed himself a cinematographic analogy while talking about his building as a series of related and chained sequences and scenes. For the whole airport design, Andreu also will shift from the design principles adopted in the Orly terminal. Now airports design had to face the true nature of a complex artifact, heterogeneity of forms and dimensions, diversity and volatility of programs, shifts in political and financial decisions, technical changes, building process, security constraints. And designers wanted to make it possible to imagine diverse scenarios for buildings and their functions. As Paul Andreu stated, the principle is to enable cohabitation, mix and confrontation of functions in a space which, in spite of this, always keeps an independent symbolic meaning. Design for Roissy will be a prototypical experience for such a vision. The original master plan with 5 terminals similar to Roissy 1 model will change well before the opening of Roissy 1. New challenges would lead to Roissy 2 model organized along the hard spine of a new territorial highway infrastructure. 4 modules would be built, this linear sequence being broken by the high-speed train station building, inaugurating on its turn the hub era with 2F and 2E terminals. And again, new terminals are pursuing the building of this organic structure with most recent satellites 3 and 4. This brief view of the airport as an experimental field for investigating the question of the frontier within the urban realm allows us to stake out several paths on exploring contemporary airport landscape as a large-scale urban artifact. First one is about the issue of periphery. The former naked airfield transformed from virgin lands to emblematic urban monuments and then to gigantic metropolitan infrastructures, megastructures. Airport exfiltration out of the city is partly responsible for its overinvestment with its accumulation of strata of urban life. In the meantime, they may contribute to the erasing of the airport as a specific and original place. However, other frames can be observed For example, airport territorial dissemination addresses the issue of reintegration of contemporary programs within the urban realm, while asking at the same time for how it could be part of the peripheral city. Second issue is on the relation between architecture and movement. As an infrastructure designed for hypermobility, airport paradoxically embodies one of the most immobile structures. And now the issue of reversibility and heritage becomes more and more acute, as we can see from Chapelhof, Le Bourget, LaGuardia airport futures, or even since 2001 and TWA bankrupt through the controversial situation of Sarin and TWA terminal. So what is the signification of heritage of future for pieces designed as futuristic prototypes? They seem to be fragilized by the volatile demands of aerial transportation, while in the same time, airport is diversifying its programs, thus apparently enabling other possibilities of use for existing buildings than pure traffic functions. If airports aim to resemble to cities, they should escape from a situation of a 50 years old ruined place, asking the possibility of their reuse. And this reflection also deals with the nature of architecture, which could break with what Rainer Baham calls in 1962 the landscapes of history. So can architecture and landscape form unstable environments, and how can it give us possibility to escape from itself? Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for that lovely talk. And then our second speaker this morning will be Dominic Pisano, who is a curator at the National Air and Space Museum, which is to say a custodian of one of our great national treasures. He holds a PhD in American Studies from George Washington University, and he's also the author of numerous books, including works on the myth and symbol of hero aviators, including Chuck Yeager, and more recently has investigated the cultural history of the airplane and aviation in America society. Welcome, Dominic. I'm sorry, his paper, the title is The Lehigh Airports Competition of 1930, What the Judges Missed.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Well, I'm happy to be here. I like the idea of getting away from my office in the museum and interacting with colleagues and trying to provide context for the history of aviation, and I think this conference has done that so far. I'm going to talk about the Lehigh Airport Competition of 1930, and I subtitle my talk, What the Judges Missed, because I think that the judges and the panel on the panel were facing a number of challenges. This was a period, to provide some historical context, this was a period of what was called air-mindedness in the United States. Promoters of aviation of all types were interested in convincing the public that flying was going to be a viable means and mode of transportation, and the way to do that was to convince the public that flying was safe. So there are a couple of keystone events. One is the Air Commerce Act of 1926, in which the government federally regulated the licensing of pilots and aircraft, but did not provide provisions for federal assistance in building airports. In 1927, Charles Lindbergh made a historic 82-city tour of the United States in the spirit of St. Louis that was sponsored by the Guggenheim Fund for the Promotion of Aeronautics, in which the express purpose was to promote commercial aviation and airport construction. And then in 1929, another venture in which Charles Lindbergh was involved, the first transcontinental airway, transcontinental air transport, one of the predecessors of what we know today as TWA, made the first regularly scheduled flights across the United States. So in 1930, the Lehigh Portland Cement Company of Allentown, Pennsylvania, saw some obvious possibilities for selling concrete in the construction of airports, and they sponsored a competition. Let me go back to the first slide here. This is the winning design by A.C. Zimmerman and William H. Harrison of Los Angeles. And you can see that it's very classical looking, Beaux-Arts. At the left, you see what was the modern airliner of the time, or at least a kind of a type of modern airliner, the Ford Trimotor. And over here, you see the tail section of a somewhat modern airliner of the time. And what I find interesting about this slide is that there are no passengers here. And the designers or the conceptualizers of this design don't seem to have made many provisions for passengers. Although you do see two leather coated pilots to the right of the picture, and there's sort of an indistinguishable person by the Ford Trimotor. I'm going to run through, this is the actual publication. This is reprinted in 1990, but the original price was $3. It was reprinted in 1990 by the American Institute of Architects. This is the jury, comprised of a mixed group of experts on aviation, architecture, city planning. One notable member, the gentleman seated in the middle of the picture, was Raymond Hood, the designer of the Daily News building, McGraw-Hill building, and later Rockefeller Center during the 1930s. This is the first prize design. $5,000 was awarded to A.C. Zimmerman and William H. Harrison, architects and engineers of Los Angeles. And again, you can see this is a view from above. It seems to me very formal, very sterile, very conventional. Another view of the first prize design. And again, no conception of how passengers would interact with the airport in 1930. I'm going to quickly run through the second, third, and fourth prize winners. Again, you can see a very traditional design, very rectangular, some provision for the landing strips, if you will, and aprons. But I don't see much difference here from one design to another. What I really want to talk about, I think, is what the judges couldn't foresee or didn't foresee. Although the first prize winner, Zimmerman and Harrison, the design was praised for its rational organization and for innovations in getting passengers from the terminal to the airplanes. I think the designs, first, second, third, fourth place designs are really not very imaginative. And here I quote Jana Eggabeen, an architectural historian whose doctoral dissertation, Airport Age, Architecture and Modernity in America, from the City University of New York. She says, quote, although stressing the need for practical designs, the competition specifications were typical of the Beaux-Arts concours. Unsurprisingly, nearly all of the designs reproduced in the catalogs adhere to Beaux-Arts planning and conventions. And it seems to me what's really important is that as part of this competition, the noted architect of California modernism, Richard Neutra, submitted his concept for an airport, which is called Rush City Air Transfer, far ahead of its time. It called for airports to be a nexus of various forms of transportation. But of course, that design was rejected. The modern airport, as we come to know it, characterized by AeroSerena's Dulles International Airport and the TWA terminal at Idlewild, were obsolescent the minute they were constructed. They just weren't suitable for jet air travel. Rainer Bonham, in an article called The Obsolescent Airport, published in Architectural Review in 1962, and another architectural historian, Thomas Leslie, both complain, Leslie talking specifically about the Pan Am Terminal building design at Idlewild, that these buildings were not really designed for what happens during the jet age. The influx of passengers, the kind of dehumanization of the romance of flight, which was a big selling point back in the 1930s. And of course, what the judges could not foresee and did not foresee was, I think there are 4 elements here. One, and particularly, I'm talking specifically about the United States, the rise of automobility, in which automobiles were privileged over other forms of transportation, particularly public transportation, and in which there was like a mad rush to drive your automobile to the airport to catch your flight, and then where are we going to park, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We've all been up against that. Automobility was promoted in many ways, and mass transportation was disregarded, essentially. I think that's still the case. The Interstate Highway Act of 1956 and the democratization of air travel in the United States after 1958, the advent of an introduction of the Boeing 707, did a lot to change the face of air travel. Another important milestone was the Airline Deregulation Act of 1978, in which the hub and spoke concept of airports and air travel was introduced, in which there were certain hubs and spokes created, which actually increased travel time, increased travel anxiety, increased delays, but what hub and spoke was seen as a kind of a consequence of deregulation. Not everybody agrees that it was a good consequence. Another milestone was the advent of the jumbo jet, the Boeing 747 in 1970, anywhere from 416 passengers to 524 or 660 passengers. And then, of course, recently, the Airbus 380, 525 passengers to 853 passengers, and the Boeing 777, which allows for fewer passengers, but has only, it's a twin-engine jet, and is more fuel efficient. Anyway, not many airports are equipped to handle these gigantic, these jumbo aircraft, as we call them, or the increased number of passengers that they bring about. 9/11 was another important milestone, not only in terms of tragedy, but the idea of using an airport as a launching pad for terrorist activity, using commercial airliners as weapons, literally. And of course, as a result of 9/11, we have tightened airport security, increased travel anxiety, et cetera, and more dehumanization. It seems to me that not really being an architectural historian or a landscape architectural expert, I really don't know where we're going. I mean, I'm encouraged to see that there is interest in this and there's a concern that airports are dehumanizing places. I came across a number of proposals for what an airport should be, could be. One idea that was floated by John D. Casarda, a professor at the Keenan Flagler Business School at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, calls for what he calls for an airtropolis in which new airports become the focal points for the cities that surround them instead of being suburban adjuncts to the city. On its face, this idea sounds frighteningly dystopian and ecologically unfriendly. More practical, perhaps, is the Federal Aviation Administration's National Plan of Integrated Airport Systems, which would encourage airport improvement and our infrastructure development in exchange for federal funds. One idea that is not very popular in political circles at the moment is high-speed rail, which, getting away from air travel entirely, might link various parts of the country and perhaps assume some of the burden that has been placed on air travel within the continental United States. But in this era of apparent American social cultural upheaval and political dysfunction, the question of the American airport's future as part of an integrated, somewhat rational transportation network is as yet unanswered. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dominic. Our next speaker this morning will be Anke Ortlepp, and she's a professor of American history at the University of Munich, but now moved to Kassel, is that right? Congratulations. She has recently spent her sabbatical at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., where she completed her book project entitled Cultures of Air Travel in Post-War America. Her new project deals with the desegregation of American airports. With a strong interest in questions of race, gender, and class, she is co-editor most recently of Germans and African Americans, 2 Centuries of Exchange. Her talk this morning is entitled Symbols of a New Age, American Airports and the Limits of Mobility. Welcome, Anke.
Thank you for the introduction, Ed, and thanks to Charles and Sonia for flying me over. This is a welcome break from a gray Bavarian November. American airports evolved as forms of architecture in the post-war decades, and so did their meaning as landmarks in American cultural landscapes. Built as symbols of a new age of mobility in the 1950s and 60s, airport terminals in the following decades came to give built expression to the limits of mobility. Congested, chaotic, and confusing, they came to symbolize aviation's dystopian aspects. At the same time, we have to understand airports, their aesthetics, spatial formations, and politics of movement as articulations of hierarchies of power in American society. For Diane Harris has reminded us, landscapes and indeed architecture are never neutral. They're always powerful symbols and containers of cultural values, just as they simultaneously work to construct culture. We therefore have to deconstruct processes of spatial formation in order to understand ideologies of gender, race, and class difference that inform them. In my talk today, we'll look at a number of case studies to explore the shifting spatial dynamics of America's aerial gateways. It argues that the spatial and aesthetic evolution of this building type reflects major developments of American post-war history, such as the reconfiguration of post-war consumer society, the mass mobilization of Americans, the shift of the national mood in the 1970s from confidence to crisis mode, and the construction of modern and postmodern subjectivities. New York City was among the many cities, and I'm going to start with that example, that invested in aviation infrastructure. Having outgrown the facilities at LaGuardia Airport, the city was going to put itself on the map as the major aviation hub in the northeastern United States with the construction of a new airport at Idlewild Field. And you see sort of a bird's eye view plan at that airport, and we have seen actually a number of pictures of that airport in previous presentations. Planners rejected a unified design scheme for the building complex and instead invited airlines to develop individual designs for their terminal structures. At a time when service features offered the only ground or the only competitive edge in a tightly regulated market for airlines, they recognized splashy architecture as an effective marketing tool. The outcome of the Idlewild design competition did not impress all architecture critics, some of who considered the new airport city an amorphous mass of uncoordinated design statements. Most agreed, though, that Pan Am's Jet H terminal and the TWA Flight Center were exceptional, and their design would have lasting effects on functional aesthetics and the language of form employed in airport architecture. And we've heard this before, that this is the TWA Flight Center designed by Finnish-American architect Eero Saarinen. At its inauguration in 1962, the building was celebrated as an architectural masterpiece that gave expression to a no post-war spirit of mobility. The terminal's free flowing concrete architecture sort of had a particular cool. It was a big step away from Beaux-Arts architecture, the dominant style in airport design during the 1930s and 40s. At the same time, it provided a bold air-age alternative to the internationalist style which inspired the design of most of the other terminals at JFK, like the terminals for Eastern American, United, which were arranged around that sort of circular space. Saarinen custom designed every element of its interior decorations, creating a Gesamtkunstwerk to communicate a message of mobility and modernity and luxury at the TWA Flight Center. He created a quintessentially mid-century modern interior, combining a simple color scheme with high-end materials and sophisticated designs. His modern aesthetic was applied to all terminal areas. The space is accessible to all travelers, as well as reserved, those reserved for the use of frequent flyers like the Ambassadors Club, and we saw a better picture, this is a bit blurry in Natalie's presentation, and spaces like the Lisbon Lounge, the London Club, the Paris cafes, restaurants and snack bars, all made to look like real places. The dining facilities offered passengers a chance to eat and calm their nerves before departure. At the same time, they offered a theme park environment that evoked anticipation and got travelers in the mood for exploration as participants in a still relatively new culture of mobility. In the 1950s and 1960s, this culture of mobility, the flashy airport architecture was advertising, was, however, mostly a white middle-class phenomenon, which reflected the dynamics of the expanding post-war consumer society, as Elizabeth Cohen and others have shown. For members of minority groups and those below the middle-class threshold, claiming a stake in the consumption of air travel meant having to overcome class and racial barriers. For African Americans, mobility was circumscribed by the limits the Southern architecture of segregation imposed, whereas Black travelers enjoyed free access to the aircraft cabin. Many airports across the South practiced Jim Crow. Studies conducted in the mid-1950s by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People showed that the vast majority of Southern airports provided duplicate facilities. To many observers, it seemed absurd that travelers who were en route to enjoy the most modern means of transportation, the airplane had to subject themselves to the humiliating experience of having to pass through a segregated terminal. And the airport in Montgomery, Alabama is an example. The terminal at Dannelly Field was a 2-story modernist structure with an air traffic control tower at the end of its concourse. Entering through the main door, travelers found themselves in the entrance area that gave them access to the ticket lobby and the main waiting area. An illuminated sign saying white waiting or reading white waiting clearly demarcated this area as off limits to African American travelers. A much smaller sign back here, a much smaller sign also illuminated reading entrance colored waiting, directed Black passengers to the waiting area reserved for Black airport clients, which was around the corner from the main area, but not immediately visible from the terminal's main door. Whereas the main waiting area, or the white waiting area, was wide and open, the colored waiting area was drab, a contained space behind glass windows. To remind Black travelers of their precarious status, the airport management had posted a sign on the wall reading, "We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone." Just outside the waiting room, the restrooms reserved for the use of African American travelers were located. An illuminated sign reading, colored in big letters, emphasized the racist motivation of their existence. The restrooms for white travelers were located in a different, more easily accessible and centrally located area. Illuminated signs reading white men restrooms and white women restrooms indicated their limited availability to a select clientele. The terminal also provided water fountains in the same area. In their complete identicalness, the water fountains can be read as the most obvious and absurd symbol of the separate but equal doctrine Dannelly Field's airport management subscribed to. Like the waiting rooms and the restrooms, their duplicate existence signified the racial hierarchy that lay at the core of the airport's spatial organization. The terminal consisted of an arrangement of clearly demarcated spaces designed to marginalize and even make invisible the existence of African American air travelers. And the segregation of airport terminal facilities was resisted and attacked on several levels through litigation, direct action, and intervention of the federal government. By 1963, the last airport that had practiced segregation was integrated. The fight for the integration of the southern access point to air travel was part of a bigger struggle over the renegotiation of racial identities in the post-war period. Construing terminal facilities as spaces essentially reserved for the use of whites, Southern white supremacists applied notions of confinement to a new spatial context in an effort to marginalize the place of African American in Southern cultural landscapes and the landscapes of transportation. Black air travelers resisted these practices, defining access to the public spaces of air travel as a right as citizens and consumers. The 1970s and 1980s saw a slow transformation of terminals, mostly from open and accessible to highly controlled, monitored, and confined spaces. And I'm sort of going over some of the themes that Christophe explored yesterday in his keynote address. Although different in scale and motivation, this transformation reproduced spatial dynamics similar to the ones racial integration had only recently abolished. Growing passenger volume was one factor that triggered the rethinking of terminal space. Security concerns over hijackings and a growing sense of gloom in the 1970s were others. Airports across the country struggled to accommodate passenger volumes. Cities like Dallas and Fort Worth built new airports. Miami and Atlanta added terminals and concourses. And airports like Chicago added makeshift extensions and structures sort of almost spontaneously. And it felt like planners had to abandon the open and transparent style that had characterized terminal architecture in the 1960s, created different travel environments along the way. And there was one really long stretch at Chicago O'Hare's airport that was nicknamed Cardiac Alley. When airport security became an issue of public concern at the end of the 1960s due to increasing numbers of hijackings and sabotage, airport planners and architects had to incorporate federal security regulation into their plans and designs. After the introduction of metal detectors in early 1973, the New York Times reported, and here you see an image at LaGuardia Airport, that security measures have already given air travel a new look at local airports. Terminals were divided into two general areas: the non-sterile area comprising the parts of the buildings accessible to everyone, and the sterile section open only to travelers who had passed security checkpoints and thus been sterilized. Terminal spaces that had once encouraged movement were now reapportioned by security technologies. At the TWA terminal, these technologies generally interfered with the building's expressive architecture. Makeshift arrangements disturbed the building's free-flowing form and held up passenger flow from the check-in counters to the gates. Architect Robert Lamhart found that terminal architecture in the 1970s and 80s lacked human scale. Terminals, he wrote, were more like machines for the efficient processing of passengers. Other critics deplored the aesthetic language of an introverted airport architecture that found expression in large concrete boxes, and the airport at Phoenix is one example. Rather than welcome travelers in the established distance, giving expression not to an earlier spirit of mobility and excitement, but to feelings of anxiety, doom, and paranoia that were associated with the 1970s. The resulting bunker mentality, which historians diagnosed, translated into a public architecture that spoke a defensive language. David Pascoe and others have commented critically on the dehumanizing effect of a purely functionalist architecture that sought to accommodate large numbers of people and keep them secure. Architecture, they suggest, became an accomplice of airlines, airport, and federal authorities to control passenger flow and curtail the mobility of air travelers, whose agency became increasingly limited. This perspective points to the limits of mobility that became apparent in the last quarter of the 20th century. Although the second half of the 20th century is generally characterized as the time when air travel was democratized and more people of different social backgrounds traveled than ever before, movement at the same time was curtailed. This curtailment expressed itself in access to airport space, which was not only dependent on a person's status of sterilization, but increasingly defined by his or her booking class. Frequent flyer programs and their spatial and design perks are an invention of the late 1980s and 1990s. Moreover, on the ground, movement was also curtailed by wait times, delays, and cancellations, often due to high traffic volume. And although airport architecture has taken a little bit of a U-turn since the 1970s and produced some terminals, probably as spectacular and exciting as the TWA Flight Center, recent theory has raised new questions about the functions or their functions in the process of subject formation. And we've heard of Marc Augé and his sort of impressions. he, defines them as the quintessential non-places of supermodernity, and in that sense, they stand for what David Pascoe has called the persistent mobility and transitoriness of post-industrial life. Thank you.
Thank you, Anke. The final speaker for this morning's panel will be Peter Ade, whose work lies at the intersection between space and cultures of security and mobility. He has written widely on mobility's conceptualization and empirical exploration through its regulation and governance, its experience, expressiveness, and embodiment, and its spaces and materialities. Peter is director of the new joint Master of Science in Geopolitics and Security program at the Royal Holloway. And his extensive list of publications includes Mobility, Aerial Life Spaces, Mobilities and Effects, 2010, and the forthcoming Air. And coming to a theater near you, the title of his talk is Terminal Termination. So welcome, Peter.
Okay, thanks for having me, and thanks to Sonia and Charles for putting together this incredible event. It's really great to be here. So, at some point last night, I think we started talking about, or was mentioned, is that we might think about airports and landscapes in relation to tension or as tension. And I just want to, before I get into this, just remember some words from a cultural geographer, not Dennis Cosgrove, but John Wiley, who talks about landscape as a tension between absence and presence, between distance and proximity, between subject and object, between visuality and sensation. And today I want to think about airports in cultural and political tension, or rather more precisely, I'm going to be thinking about airports in suspension. I want to talk about how the vitality of an airport might be made quite fragile by adjustments of the flows that give it life, to talk specifically about different sorts of mobilities that perforate the airport border's skin. That is, I want to talk about evacuation. Evacuation not of the airport itself, but from events such as disasters, civil war, and territorial conflict. The airport suspended in emergency and becoming a very particular kind of way out. Now, this is part of a longer intellectual project of not only on airports, but of evacuation as a political kind of technology used to move and manage peoples to safety in crisis. I'm trying to establish where these sorts of practices have come from, how states administer evacuations, what are their technologies, what are their arts, their cultures, and their design. But also the ways in which evacuation seems to me to hide a multitude of sins. How evacuations value only particular kinds of lives, how evacuation has often been a misnomer for displacement, internment, and dispossession, violent motions by other means and other names, and how nature's abhorrence, the vacuum, in this context, is never perfect. There are always people left behind in the airport. So in the time I've got left, I'm going to discuss how airports reconfigure themselves in relation to an evacuation sort of geometry, which is to speak of chains of interaction, holding and feeder sites, to particular telescoping of space, laws, resources, governance, and more extensive networks and flows and orderings of airspace, territory, and force, in a bit like the kind of consternations of scale that Peter Gallison was talking about last night, but in this case, all in order to move people out of the way. Okay, so it's not unusual for airports to play a role in emergency. The airport performs a secondary shadow function as a logistical interchange for evacuees, as a relay point, and often as a temporary shelter. During Hurricane Katrina, it was remarkable just how quickly the international airport was reopened, deliberately for evacuation. And so 24 hours after the storm first hit, the airport became a main evacuation node to house patients from 23 of the 26 hospitals in the city then underwater, and to airlift 2,700 patients to safety and 25,000 people to further shelters. At its peak, a helicopter arrived between every 15 and 45 seconds. So the store-forward logistical logic of this kind of processing spatially articulates, and terminal space gets redefined. For the first 6 hours, the upper departure level became a treatment area. The baggage claim was quickly used as a staging area, and as the pictures illustrate, people became objects that needed to be moved and triaged, using the local infrastructure of the airport, its runways, its apron, its baggage conveyors, its baggage carts, the baggage area, and so on to do so. And so in these kinds of images, bodies become literally baggage, or like baggage, and also baggage becomes beds. Doctors can try to convey the confusion of the environment. They describe the roar of the rotor blades, the smell of the jet fuel, and the thousands of eyes looking at us for answers, for hope. So under particular emergency conditions, the airport's very localised spaces, its mechanisms for processing movement, and its relation to a much wider spatiality of airspace, flight routes, cities, and regions, in these moments, I think, switches. And what I want to do for the rest of the talk is follow this into a timeline of a recent conflict. I'm going to focus on the conflict in Libya. So evacuation happens to some extent well in advance of itself. And evacuation is an anticipatory kind of space because it consists of a wide range of planning activities that provide a series of protocols and processes that are rehearsed and practiced in order for the evacuation to respond to some manner of surprise. And evacuations are then as punctual as the events that cause them. So a week from the February protests in Libya in 2011, in a deteriorating situation as rebel groups and militias challenged the government, foreign nationals were soon demanding that their states took responsibility for them. But evacuation seems always to be too slow. Public opinion at home, in Britain and elsewhere, vocalised that their governments were not acting, that their decisions were inept or paralysed. Why were they not moving people out of the way? Now, the necessity of getting people out through airports relies upon a wide range of things. It relies upon the success of state departments and foreign offices to exercise pressure on airlines, but also to organise their own charter flights or commence non-combatant evacuation operations, NEOs, with military support. But piercing airspace, or the ways we might think about airspace as a kind of volumetric territory by militaries, is of course not always easy because it breaks the law. It's a sign of aggression, it breaks international laws. But some emergency conditions can render sovereignty highly contingent. So under what kind of jurisdictions are military non-combatant evacuation operations permissible? Well, under international and national law they aren't, unless explicit permission is given or the intervention to evacuate nationals becomes justified on the grounds of national defence under Article 51 of the UN Charter. Whilst the UN Security Council's no-fly zone resolution in late March would offer provision for exactly that under its protection. But until that point, other governments and interested corporates and businesses flirted with a variety of different territorial incursions which drew on Libya's airports, its ports, its airfields and landing strips, turning them into a network of evacuation links, nodes and processes. Extraterritorial vectors then were coordinated far beyond Libya's airports by foreign embassies, although the UK first sent a rapid deployment team to a consulate in Tripoli to delegate, whilst the HMS Cumberland sat waiting outside the port of Benghazi, as would other nations' ships, hopping backwards and forth to Malta, where the Maltese airport became an international hub for the evacuation effort, a strange remnant in some ways of colonial power. A non-combatant evacuation operation coordination cell was established in the UK High Commission in Malta, supported by a cell in Crete, also where thousands of Chinese workers would be ferried to Crete from Benghazi on Greek charter ferries, and a team in London coordinating the response between 16 different nations on a mix of different militaries' aircraft. The Maltese government will also set up their own evacuee processing hub in the airport, sorting over 8,000 people from over 50 countries in 7 days, arriving by or hopping from ferry, from aircraft to be flown elsewhere. And so in these kinds of moments, scale does something strange. Scale gets collapsed through the airport as the logics and the techniques and the rationalities of acting in crisis, or what becomes known as crisis management, which is a particular kind of set of practices and I think probably epistemologies, takes over. Even during the imposition of the no-fly zone, Europe's airspaces, were even adjusted, as the flight routes were advised by the newly inaugurated European Aviation Crisis Coordination Cell, they like their coordination cells, led by Eurocontrolled, which was designed in the aftermath of the airspace shutdown during the ash cloud crisis of 2010, now routinely exercising multinational disruptive events as Libya's logic informs future planning. So like aircraft crashes that we thought about last night, emergency also catalyses change. And indeed, these are the UK new evacuation measures following a recent review, following the events in Libya. Okay, but in contrast to the refugees and the migrants that would escape Libya's land borders, and note different categories of mobile subject here, those evacuated by airport tend to be for the already internationally mobile, those exhibiting what Mimi Scheller might describe as a mobility capability, shaped as much by their own ends and means as by state resources, as by that state's military prowess, and by domestic political will. And so the airport's usually differentiated streams of movement and maybe class get divided and bifurcated on more kinds of intense lines than usual on the grounds of nationality and citizenship, I just think in more heightened sorts of ways. So which countries have planned to hook their populations out of harm's way becomes then the key dividing line, as Tripoli's main terminal became a camping ground for thousands of Tunisians, Eritreans and Egyptians trying to leave but they can't. Condensation drips from the overcrowded building's ceiling in the worsening conditions. The evacuees were embassy and consulate officials and their families, journalists, and a large proportion of Turkish, Italian, and Chinese construction workers, electrical engineers, geologists, and lenders, and of course oil workers placed in more remote parts of the country. In many ways, the oil workers were the liquid workers, in Bauman and Urry's terms. They were highly mobile and whisked away by the fluid resources that they helped to extract. Now, the first evacuation flights were slow coming. 457 permits had been applied for by the 22nd of February. Charter services would normally wait for 18 hours for a response from these kinds of applications, so there was an enormous backlog. And when charter flights finally got into Tripoli, Brits and other nationalities effectively jumped the queue in what was described as the hellish airport, the terminal's usual sterility and order undermined by demonstrations on both sides and by those trying to get out, getting in. And so the airport was full of hundreds of North Africans, Bangladeshi manual workers, tens of thousands in the country who were not so lucky. And the kind of descriptions ring of sort of J.G. Ballardic kind of themes and degradation. Several UK RAF aircraft headed for the airport were pushed back, threatened with being intercepted by Libyan fast jets. Canadian charter flights were refused landing in Benghazi before returning to Istanbul, and in the confusion, other Canadian planes left Tripoli empty because there were no Canadian nationals waiting at the airport. The Ukrainian government decided not to send the plane on the 23rd of Feb because a curfew in Tripoli meant that nationals could not find safe passage from the city to the airport, so those connections were really tested. And by the 27th of February, Kenya's charter that went through Cairo and back to Nairobi was also heavily delayed by those curfews. To retrieve oil workers in the more remote areas, states began to flout Libya's airspace inviolability. UK SAS officers arrived in Tripoli in plain clothes before heading into the desert to marshal the workers to rebel airfields where they were picked up by 3 aircraft illegally entering airspace, once again from Malta. And you see then in Britain and various other states then using these evacuation moments as sort of good PR moments for these quite privileged passengers, if you can make them out. Even BP would extract over 100 of its own personnel in this way, while Canada would direct its own operations a week later in Operation Mobile to rescue Canadian Entitled Persons, or CEPs, flying Hercules in again from Malta. And so just some concluding words. Under these sorts of conditions then, what happens to airports? Can airports die? Are they terminated? In many conflicts, airports become battlegrounds because they promise logistical or nodal prestige, as well as practical entry points for supply. Holding the airport and its landscape does seem to signify. Even if both Benghazi and Tripoli's main airports became unusable when NATO warplanes destroyed the airport's radar and control tower. And so the no-fly zone, as Mark Neoclear has recently argued in Radical Philosophy, it becomes a kind of ground occupation too. But then, like Cyprus's Nicosia International Airport, landlocked in the UN-controlled buffer zone, Libya's airports are not in permanent suspension, just an interrupted one. And I think evacuation helps us to take these kinds of tensions seriously. And just as a kind of epilogue, I suppose, last year, Benghazi was turned to the hands of the new National Transitional Council from militia. The airport had reopened in November 2011, manned by armed forces who are running the airport and awaiting a pay deal to absorb them into Libya's interior and defence ministries. Gun battles for the airports have been frequent. Tripoli retaken last year by militia, demanding the release of their leader detained by security forces. And that's where I'll leave it. Thanks very much.
I invite our speakers up to the dais, and we'll have a brief discussion and invite questions from the audience. First of all, I just wanted to thank all our speakers for this lovely array of presentations, and wanted to make two very quick general comments and then perhaps introduce some terms for discussion. The first is, I was very struck by Peter's talk and the notion of evacuation and the analogy one might draw then between the airport and the air pump as an instrument for effecting evacuation. And the extent to which the airport is serving for us today in the way that the air pump did for our colleagues Chapin and Schaefer as kind of a privileged object of regard with which to understand certain societal, political, epistemic relations, and how productive it appears to be in that way. And with that, take up your notion of suspension, a suspended object, and it struck me how compelling it was to think of a shift between lift and the excitement, the potentialities that are produced by lift and loftiness in early flight, and what you're describing as the dire emergency of the airlift and the contingencies and the suspended space-time relations that it brings into being. And just as a slight appendage to that, as a general comment, I would, in listening to these talks, I was compelled by the extent to which landscape architecture has within its capacity certain techniques that belong to aviation itself, which is to say control surfaces, which is, we think so much of thrust and motion and speed, but the underlying magic of flight is the control surfaces, which is something as landscape architects we are in a real position to provide. So with that said, and referring to our own disciplinary capacities, I thought some of the common and really conspicuous themes this morning were the issue of limits, and liabilities that come along with them, obviously modulating and creating various definitions of mobilities. And here, of course, with Anka's talk having to do with social, racial, economic relations, and with Natalie's talk, particularly with the notion of frontiers, which I found very compelling. The other, which I thought was shared in some way by the talks, was the notion of obsolescence, or the extent to which the structures and schemes we've been looking at are the rate at which they become obsolescent, or they in fact might engender a discourse of obsolescence by the speed at which the technologies they're subservient to are advancing. And the final comment there would be the way in which limits themselves become obsolescent, which seems to be a theme has been addressed collectively, whether it's racial delimitations, territorial delimitations, or national sovereign delimitations. So that I just put across some general themes for the panel.
Do you want us to
Yeah, please, I'm done. I just thought if there are any comments you want to add, and then we can certainly open up to the floor. Yeah, please.
I just have some comments on the presentations through the panel. First thing is maybe about the paper of Dominique about one moment, one shifting moment from the Virgin Land, the airfield, to the monumental airport, and the things that the judges didn't see at this moment. That is the massification and the fact that the mass transportation was not expected. I remember during the project of renovation of Le Bourget in 1937, the authorities didn't think for public transportations because, of course, it was for elites and so for international visitors, and so they didn't need to take the train. So it's a context. And so I wonder today what we don't see and what we miss, because, of course, it's a real topic that we miss. And each year, each decade, we have new events and new things. The other thing is about the paper about evacuation, which is fascinating, and which shows through the images how the airport can be reversible. The reversibility of airport we can see also through the disused and decommissioned airports, which provide a fascinating project. So this kind of reversibility and the mixed use of airports that can be used either in a somber perspective, either in an optimistic perspective, and also about the limits of mobility with I think this fascinating images and either for races or also for security constraints and for others. And so the dogma of hypermobility, which is completely broken by the reality of limits of mobility. So that could be my first comment. So.
I think I'd like to reiterate that this competition, as interesting as it is historically, was somewhat limited and restrictive. First of all, it seems to me it was sponsored by a company for what seemed to me to be purely commercial purposes, to sell concrete. Obviously, and there really have been some good work done on the transition from airfield to airport, where you have literally a grass field for flying, and aircraft that are not suited to it, and actually a complicated kind of formula for how to build a runway that would be sustainable over long periods of time and repeated use. It seems to me that from that publication that I used, and unfortunately I was not able to investigate any further, some of these considerations really weren't taken into consideration. Some of these ideas, some of these perhaps things that should have been accounted for were not. But to be fair to the jury, they're kind of flying blind, if you will. They're at the time, I think in 1926 and 27, there were only 18,000 passengers being flown in the United States. So that's just a terribly small number. There weren't very many airports. And municipalities, of course, without federal aid, this is an era of where I think the prevailing sentiment was that cities were responsible. And in fact, I came across a quotation from someone who claimed that airports were as important to a city as ports were during, at ports and ship navigation and so on and so forth, in terms of sea commerce. So they were restricted. They couldn't see into the future. They couldn't see how incredibly popular air travel became with the advent of jet travel, and to give, for example, to give Serene and his due, these were beautiful buildings. Dulles International is still quite beautiful, but the area surrounding it has changed entirely. I mean, at one point it sat in the middle of a huge area of land with nothing else around it. Well, that is not the case any longer. And so getting there and getting back from there, speaking from personal experience, is really difficult.
Maybe we can open it up to the audience for comments and questions. Please, there's
I'd like to thank the panelists for really fascinating historical and cultural investigations there. And I thought that Edward's summing up was really apposite. And I'm sitting here looking at this image, which is a very beautiful image, and it's elemental. And I think that what really struck me about just about all of the presentations in different ways is this idea of the intersection of elements of air and land, a very obvious point to make. But of course, this has enormous consequences. And Dominic's talk about Lehi and the strangeness and the oddity and what was missed in those designs. The biggest thing that was missed of all was the elemental. And that's to say, all those crisscrossing runways were completely pointless because planes take off and land, or land into the prevailing wind. And the prevailing wind doesn't turn 360 degrees. And most airports are built into the prevailing wind. And that's, in a sense, what was the absurdity of the competition. And that whole question of what airports do with the elemental environment as well, I think, lies behind also this fascinating shift that a lot of you were making between, in a sense, the agricultural origins of the airport and then the industry. The airport, in a sense, is a factory of flow, of industrial flow, and that imperceptible shift from the agricultural to the industrial was something which struck me in different ways in all of your talks. Now, I wonder if the panel would like to reflect on that a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you for that interesting comment. Just sort of listening to you and listening to what my co-panelists just said in response to Ed's comments, I think, it strikes me that the airport, is a place of economic exchanges, social interactions. It, connects different elements, and it's, sometimes makes me rethink what we make of that as a space and a place. That's sort of a question that the speakers this morning and yesterday touched on, and I think if we want to understand that, we have to remember that not everyone, this is something that we haven't talked about at all, is passing through, but that there are thousands and tens of thousands in some places of people who work at the airport, or the refugees, who do not spend a few hours in a fancy business lounge, but they're stuck. Or think of that one passenger in Steven Spielberg's The Terminal who spent almost a decade living at an airport. And I think, sort of taking in their experience and their perspectives, we probably have to rethink the meanings and the shifting cultural meanings of airports in our societies.
Shall I say something? I'll say something. Yeah, thank you, and thanks for your comments as well. Yeah, I think I've kind of been working with sort of how do you take, though, the elemental seriously, and how can you think about the elements so that it goes beyond a kind of something that we talk about or something that's held within discourse? And you know, I think part of the way that I'm finding it very productive, but also struggling with an element like air, and the process of taking something away to create a space where nothing is in, a nothing or a vacuum, is to sort of push it beyond allegory and push it beyond metaphor. So I'm finding it very productive in my own work, because I'm kind of looking at these spaces of evacuation and seeing that they are almost never vacuums. There's always life left in them, but it's a life that's been devalued, or that hasn't been cared for, or hasn't been moved away, or hasn't been planned for. But the other side to that is sort of, is there something about the elemental that is anterior to our symbols and our images, that is sort of beyond, you know, certainly beyond our ways of thinking about culture, but that is more of a kind of inhuman kind of thing, that might possess us, or that might draw us into perhaps older, you know, even mythological ways of thinking about the elemental, that there are these forces going on outside of ourselves, and that we're sort of just riding on. And I can't say much more than that, but I think it's a really, really interesting space to pursue. And it seems to me that they do matter. They because we kind of have to interact with the elements. We have to build things that have to withstand them, and I think we think through them, and we even talk about them with a certain kind of power. So thank you for that kind of that gesture.
I'm sorry, I'd just like to say to your comment that you're right about the kind of absurdist aspect of this competition and the designs. And in fact, none of these are ever built. The designers really did not become notable as airport builders later on.
There's a question in the back.
I was struck also how with the airports, so often they're about a kind of a branding of a future or an identity or a place, and that there's almost sort of a miniaturization going on, you know, Cafe Lisbon, or having the tulips in the big pots or something. And what happens, it seems, that when we repurpose these places into landscapes, that we start to reconnect then again with the ground and the terrain and the place as the place, and we let go of some of these sort of trying to brand New York or brand any of these elements of the travel. That romance has to go away. And in that happening, do we really need to hang on to some of that, you know, does the architecture of the airstrip have to sort of remain as this organizational element? Because we've all of you are talking very much about this sort of the cultural overlay, but when that all goes away and this is now becoming a park, how much of that social political layers that were so active upon this place need to be celebrated in the future?
Can I sort of shoot a question back to you? Are you referring to sort of, you know, airports as a global culture, and that, you know, national branding or even local branding is becoming less important, or?
No, it's just interesting that when they're actually active airports and they are that sort of processing of passengers, but they're also bringing along this expectation or the romance of travel, which I think is still there, even though we have the sterile zone and the non-sterile zone and the colored zone and the non-colored zone, all these things. I think there's still some of that romance behind all these places, even in the moment of wanting to escape. But when all of that function goes away and it's now a space that is being rehabilitated towards a new use, I think it's very interesting how much of that sort of goes on and plays itself out there. But then there's a point with some of these other examples where it's no longer an active airport and it's now going to be a park. But we hang on to these elements of it, like we're hanging on to celebrating the former airfield.
I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah, thank you for the introductions. I have a question for the panelists to comment, please. Two observations of me where I cannot find a resolution. So I'm interested how you see these things. The first thing is, do you believe airport authorities like the chaos? They like the monster. They would love to cultivate the stress to sell business class and business elite and this kind of quasi VIP treatment of a small group which can be built 5 times more than. This is a sort of fundamental issue. I never figure out what is happening. And the second thing is speculation on the future. Working in airport authority land, what struck me is that it's completely a male-driven world. Technology, security, efficiency, walking distance, what fits, what doesn't fit. And there's almost a pure absence of feminine logic there, except for the shopping, which is mainly, they really design the shopping to be accessed for women easier because they spend more dollars. And you see this conflict in the terminal, literally. So these two observations, cultivation of chaos, is that a nature or not? Or is it just the case? And how is there a future feminine airport?
Does anyone want to go ahead? I mean, cultivation of chaos. Sounds a little bit like a big conspiracy theory. It probably depends a little bit on your perspective. Sonia and I recently took a tour at Frankfurt Airport that gave us sort of an inside perspective, and a lot of things seemed a lot less chaotic, even in my female perspective. So I don't know. I mean, that would mean that regulatory authorities would consciously manipulate travelers into feeling anxiety, insecurity, and just being sort of senseless victims and being processed through that airport machine. I'm not sure. That's a possible reading, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, if you asked, they probably wouldn't tell you. I guess that parts of airport management can be very male environments. I guess in the past you found the feminine touch in the cabin with the beautiful flight attendants taking care of male passengers in particular. I think it's an interesting question to study airports from a gender studies perspective. And I don't think I can sort of say something to that sort of off the top of my head, but maybe someone else can.
I'd just like to say very briefly that to your question about male domination, I think in America at least, flying was always and still is a male-dominated area of commerce, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In the so-called golden age, which the 20s and 30s, in which I'm working, women were used as sort of figureheads. They were never employed in the real commercial business of flying. They were given jobs in public relations, et cetera, et cetera. And again, there have been recent studies on airline flight attendants and that whole issue of glamour and their subservience to the male audience, if you will. So yeah, I would agree with you that there's probably a significant remnant of that in aviation today, in commercial aviation. I think I can speak only for the United States, but my sense is that that's still very much true.
Okay, I think. Oh, I'm sorry.
Just a female opinion. Well, I never go and shopping in the airport, so I must be the wrong customer for airport authorities. What I'm searching for is a quiet, calm place to see planes. And last time I took a plane, it was for coming here. I stayed 2 hours in the process queues and security flows, so I was like a sheep, as now it's passengers who are sheep. So it's another kind of ecology, but this is true that airport authorities are like empires. And there was a famous book from James Doig about the Port Authority of New York, which was entitled Empire in Hudson. So there are empires, there are national empires, for example, for France, because Paris Airport Authority is a national enterprise which has been created short after the war within the context of de Gaulle government and so on. And they also developed, they cannot escape from develop a total vision, and so a totalitarian vision also, because it's linked. So it's a total scape. And so maybe a hope is with the failures, with the crisis moments, such as the ones you show, Peter, and the moments where people can escape from this very controlled landscape. And I think about I-mobility and I-mobility of people who work in the airport. That's true. 60,000 people are working in Roissy Airport, and they are refugees also, and they are different places. And so we can see some strategies to escape from it, to invent other things. So maybe it's a way also to see another facade of airport, which is not controlled by the Empire Airports Authority.
Okay, don't forget to visit the duty-free shop on your way out. And please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists this morning.
Thank you very much. Thank you, the panelists, and Ed Eigen for moderating this panel. I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Ken Smith. Ken Smith's practice, landscape architecture practice, explores the relationship between art, contemporary culture, and landscape. He established Workshop Ken Smith Landscape Architect in 1992 and has taught and lectured at universities and institutions around the world. Smith's work has been published widely in the popular and trade press, and I believe he's going to take us to the West Coast today. So please join me in welcoming Ken Smith.
Okay, good. Thank you. My presentation is going to focus on issues of scale and the adaptation and transformation of decommissioned airport space. As many people have already mentioned, airports with their conditions of flattened terrain, repressed ecology, restricted access, and presence of runway and related aviation infrastructure present unique challenges and opportunities in reuse for public park space. The challenges range from site remediation of brownfield conditions to developing new ecologies and restoration of ecological linkages to surrounding contextual areas, as well as programming new recreational spaces and human programs. Opportunities include the potential for creating new spatial organization and scales of operation that give structure to multiple uses and have potential to affect the neighborhoods around the site. I think also the aspect of time becomes a salient issue in most of these large sites because they are not quickly transformed and reoccupied in single phases. Strategies for development and growth over time must be considered in parallel to issues of scale and space. So this is a project that was a result of a competition that was won in January of 2006. The team included Mia Lehrer, Enrique Norton, Mary Miss, Stephen Handel, Bureau Happold, and GAFCON. We don't seem to be advancing. There we go. The site, the 4,500 acre site, of which 1,360 acres is to become public park, sits very much geographically in the center of Orange County. The button is, there we go. And it's interesting that to the east and west, there's a sort of cultural divide. The older suburbs to one side and the newer suburbs to the other. But more critically, the site really sits to the north and the south between major ecological areas of the county. The Cleveland National Forest and the nature reserves to the north, and the Laguna Coast wilderness areas and the Pacific Ocean to the south. And the role the park plays in linking these ecological terrains together and corridors is a significant part of the project. Now, I want to go through a series of different scales, multiple scales of operation fairly quickly. I think the first is these are vast spaces. When you stand on a runway like this, which most people don't have the opportunity to do, it's both kind of very exciting and kind of frightening. And if you happen to stand on a runway like this in Southern California in the middle of August when the temperatures are approaching 100 degrees, it can really be quite oppressive. It's also a space that's sublimely beautiful. These are very powerful places. And El Toro is particularly beautiful in the way that it's a kind of a shallow space situated within the context of foothills and mountains. And the mountains really hold this space in a very beautiful way. Our approach to sustainability on the site was really targeted to a California audience. I don't mean to be rude, but a kind of me orientation. So it really focuses on personal health because everybody's interested in that. Everybody has a need to be concerned about that. But from there, our intent was to reach out to larger issues of regional health and global health. And do that through programs of energy, water, people, materials, and nature. So a large part of the design is really generated by the scale of personal health. How do you get people active? How do you get people to think about issues of their relationship to nature and whether they're living healthy lifestyles, having a good diet, getting exercise? So there's a strong part of the program dealing with issues of health and a very strong sport program in the park because of that. Community is something that's a critical issue in Southern California. The public spaces are largely beaches and shopping malls, and the shopping mall isn't exactly public space. But there is a real need for a place of community, for people to come together in a public space and meet other people. So that also is a major part of the program. And then finally, the scale of ecological habitats and ecological restoration, reconnecting this place to the wildlife and the terrain and the habitats of the region. There's a certain scale of historic resources. We recognize that the cultural remains of the runways was a very important thing, as well as other scales of things like buildings and small things like airplane lights and things. So there's varying scales of preservation. There was a recognition of creating different scales of places and spaces that would organize the park and be tied together with the ecological restoration and creation of new habitats in the park. And this was the master plan, and there are large-scale natural systems that create a gradient from native moving through California appropriate plantings and regimes to areas that are more culturally determined. We made a conscious effort to maintain the runway spaces, including a 2-mile stretch of one of the major runways and a 1.5-mile stretch of one of the taxiways for a timeline. There's a scale of circulation systems of how you actually move people around a park, a site this size, and how you connect things together. The goal was to get people out of their cars to park once and spend the day and actually discover places that they might not have intended to come for. And a scale of time, thinking about what is a 20-minute zone, moving at a leisurely pace. How much space do people occupy in a small amount of time? So this is the existing site, flat. It's a very, very, very uniform 1.5% slope across the entire site. The streams that were there formerly have been buried. They're channelized. They're underground. And there's very little vegetation. This was the master plan created for the site with a strong central element of a man-made canyon, daylighting of the Agua Shannon stream, and the creation of a wildlife corridor. And these three ecological corridors, if you will, are really intended to tie together the mountains and the foothills in a very fluid and adaptable way. It's not one single route for wildlife. And it's predicated on a strong set of earthworks, a major regrading of the site. I think it's, as I recall, about 5 or 6 million cubic yards of earth that we propose to move. And in my observation, when you move around Southern California, Californians are very efficient in moving earth. Caltrans moves tons of earth. Currently, they're reshaping the entire Long Beach stretch of the 405 with massive earthworks and flyovers. And the developers, like the Irvine Company, when they take over a site and create a new housing community, they also move massive amounts of earth. So the idea of moving earth to create space seems fairly eminently efficient to me, although debatable. The canyon is really a central place of respite, really a place that draws on the regional landscape, but does it with, I think, intentionally sense of poetry, and creates a place that would be very desirable and intimate. The basic earthwork module was based on the munition bunkers. When I went to the site, there were these very beautiful complexes of bunkers where the munitions were buried. And they were typically in a height range of around 24 or 30 feet height with engineered slopes. And when you stood among these bunkers and the spaces between them, there was something very nice about the scale of the 24 feet relative to the human scale, and creating space that you could actually understand within this flat terrain. And there was also something very beautiful in the relationship of the scale of these bunkers to the larger landscape beyond to the foothills. There's a kind of speaking of these landforms to that other landscape that pulled the foothills into the site itself. And so that scale of 30 feet of fill and 30 feet of cut created our basic module of a 60-foot canyon depth, which is about 400 or 500 feet wide, and then a wider area at the bottom that got deeper and wider, and served as the holding basin of water for stormwater and irrigation supply for the park, because California gets 13 inches of rain a year. We started out immediately designing the topographies, because that was my particular strong interest in the park. And we did old-fashioned hand-scale drawings at 1 inch equals 30 feet of the canyon topography, which is about 2 miles long. So that was a considerably long set of drawings. And we also started to build models at 1 inch equals 30 feet, because I was very concerned about the human scale of these earthworks and how they would fit into the site and relate to the larger context. We did very detailed topography studies. It was completely ADA accessible, and the drainage structures were all worked out in great detail. We moved into computer modeling to understand the plastic forms and how they started to shape the larger site and create larger terrain. In green, you can see the slope terraces of the Botanical Garden, which Mia, Lara, and I were both very interested in as a place that would speak to the both the native and adopted cultural and natural landscapes. And the lake that was at the lower part of the canyon with the Botanical Garden Bridge that spanned the chasm, if you will. Working with Stephen Hadendow, the creation of wildlife areas, islands and things and rockeries to create areas for snakes and bats, and bats eat a huge amount of mosquitoes and very important to the plan. And some videos that start to give a sense of the scale of the space and the relation of these landforms to the mountain ranges beyond. I think the topographies were really intended to create a space that was distinct, that had a sense of enclosure, framed spaces for human occupation, but also very specifically framed views out beyond to the larger landscape and made connections to the region. This shows one of those very specific cuts that we made in the canyon that frames a view out to the Saddleback Mountains. And then a small area of springs, which would have been naturally fed through the bioswales and would provide a specific habitat that Stephen Hadendow was interested in, of kind of wet, rocky, moist slopes. And then ultimately the pretty pictures that you all have to create for public consumption and to sell the idea of a park as a kind of a beautiful, enticing, and exciting place to go. With embedded buildings, Enrique Norton, I thought, in a great act of sort of repressed egotism, suggested that all the buildings should in fact be buried and not expressions of verticality. So then I would just want to briefly update you on what has happened post master plan and comprehensive design. The project has moved forward in some small parts. The early activation projects are the 150-acre western sector and the preview park. A large emphasis on sustainable agriculture because that actually occupies space pretty quickly and is good for remediating soils. Farm and food lab, which fits into the health program that we're promoting. Soccer fields, which promote physical activity. The observation balloon, kids walk, walkable timeline, and north and south lawns, as well as the Palm Court Arts Complex, which is a recycling of old hangar buildings. The preview park is the area in red, and the very first thing we did was we put up an orange observation balloon, which is really operating at the scale of identity. It's visible from the I-5, so everybody going from Los Angeles to San Diego knows where the Great Park is. And if you happen to live nearby and you go up in the park, you have access to see the park built over time. And if you're lucky, you can probably see your house. I can see my apartment from the balloon, which is always nice when I'm there. And it was also allowed us to start prototyping some of the features. And in fact, and letting people into the site with a series of provisional features initially, and starting to create places of community, if you will. And the connections beyond. So the first earthwork that I got to build on the site was the area around the balloon. It's only 12 feet high. But it did start to make a case for using earth to create space. We also engaged in a prototyping of recycling of runway materials and using native plants. Here's part of the recycling. And the notion of growing a park that's going to happen over time. Here is an interim parking lot that's developed as a holding nursery of plants for the park. Another prototype for a walkable timeline to start to speak to the history of the site, done very cheaply here with paint, but effectively, I think. And this is part of the park that has been built to date. This is the arts complex, beautiful old hangar and two warehouse buildings that have been turned into an exhibition space and a studio space, and the large building is a multi-purpose space that handles a lot of different cultural and community uses. Very iconic Southern California place. And also starting to make these connections to the landscape beyond. Some views of that work that has been done to date, including a very nice parking lot, well detailed, that collects the water and takes it into a series of bioswales and treatment areas vegetatively. So now I want to close with the scale of political risk, because a project of this size is very political. Last January, the Tea Party aligned council majority took control of the council, and one of their very first actions was to terminate the independent board of directors for the park. So it's been a difficult time. The developer of the developments around the site has proposed to take control of the park and build the park at a much lower cost and a quicker pace than the public, predicated on following their designs for the park. And in the newspaper article, Great Parks Best Shot ? You can see that the developer is proposing to eliminate the canyon and convert the very large central part of the park into a large golf course. And last Monday's Los Angeles Times, I was on the front page above the fold. As part of this ongoing controversy, the city council was to have met the following night on Tuesday night, which they did. They went into a long session that lasted late into the night and decided that they couldn't design, have adjourned for 2 weeks. So I guess the conclusion is not concluded yet, but it looks very likely that the Orange County Great Park will become the Orange County Golf Park. Thank you.